Joining us now, NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake, Financial Times U.S. national editor Ed Luce, and CNBC senior analyst and commentator Ron Insana. Ron, rates remaining unchanged. Yep. So explain to us what that means.
So the Federal Reserve is still looking at the balance of data that it has in front of it. We saw the GDP report this morning, which, as you said, came in stronger than expected. But when combined with the first quarter, we're actually growing more slowly right now than we have in the prior 2 years, at about a 1.2% annual rate if you average the numbers. Inflation is still a little stickier than the Fed would like. I'm reading through the statement that the Fed just released to hold rates unchanged. They're not hinting in this statement that rates are going to go down in September as many had hoped. That may come up during the question and answer session with Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell at 2:30. There were two dissents, as expected, Governors Waller and Bowman, both of whom may be in line for the Fed chairmanship next year, but they're looking to push rates down earlier rather than later. I believe that Federal Reserve Chair Powell is justified in holding rates where they are because we're still not sure what the impact of tariffs are going to be on inflation going forward.
So you aren't foreseeing that we will see a rate drop, at least for the foreseeable future?
Well, the market is. There's about a 70% chance priced into financial markets that the Fed will cut in September. But in the statement itself, there was no indication that the Fed is leaning in that direction. They're talking about incoming data and how they'll be dependent upon that before they make any decision to make a move.
Well, I know you will closely monitor that for us. Ed, Fed Chair Jerome Powell is one of the few officials who has managed to withstand some of the president's pressures. Why is Trump pushing so hard for these rates to be cut?
So I think he knows how important interest rates are to consumer sentiment and therefore voter sentiment out there in America. It is extremely expensive nowadays relative to the last few decades to take out a mortgage and buy a home, that we're seeing sort of lows in terms of the numbers of young Americans who are able to afford their first home. So he's acutely aware of that. But I mean, of course, Jerome Powell is also acutely aware of the fact that the Fed has a twin mandate. The first and most important of which is to keep inflation at 2% or below, or average rate of 2%. And with the trade war still in full throes and, serious tariff effects coming in to consumer prices, it would be negligent of the Fed to cut interest rates at this point. It would be like throwing fuel on a fire.
Garrett, the president just moments ago blasting Fed Chair Jerome Powell yet again for not lowering those interest rates. What else did he have to say?
Yeah, Ariel, importantly, this was moments before the Fed made their announcement that they wouldn't change rates. So the president likely to be disappointed but not surprised by the Fed's move today. In this case, the president upset because he said that keeping the rates high would negatively affect home buyers. That would make it more difficult, if not impossible, for many people to be able to get and pay for a mortgage, and that is another reason the rates should come down. It was in relation to a bill he was signing to try to make home loans more affordable for veterans. It's just another sort of angle of attack from a president who has made no secret of his distaste for the Fed chair that he appointed, who's not following what he believes is his clear direction.
Yeah. OK, so, Ron, the U.S. economy, as we mentioned at the top of the show, is growing at a stronger pace than expected, up 3% in the second quarter. But we also know, as you had mentioned, the annual growth is slower than what we saw between 2023 and 2024 and the year prior to that. So help us make sense of that.
Well, so there were a lot of disruptions in the data in the first quarter GDP numbers and the second quarter GDP numbers having to do with the imposition of tariffs. So in the first quarter, there were a lot of imports that came in that depressed GDP growth. There were fewer that came in the second quarter that pushed the number up. And we can get really deeply into the weeds on this. Suffice to say, when you average the two numbers, it is about a 1.2% annual rate of growth. The problem, it's interesting with respect to housing, the president pointed out, isn't really the level of interest rates. If you look at what's happened since the great financial crisis and the pandemic, we are short about 4.5 million homes relative to demand in the United States. It's not so much an interest rate problem per se. Rates were very low for a long period of time, so people have much cheaper mortgages if they purchase during that period. It's harder now because home prices are up 45% since the pandemic, and rates are back to their historic average. So it's making it very difficult for young people to buy homes. But it's not just a Federal Reserve issue.
It seems as though the economy has absorbed some of the uncertainty, but we have economists warning of this underlying weakness in the economy. Explain that to us.
So we're seeing that, the number of job openings are reduced. We're seeing that continuing jobless claims of unemployment benefits are higher than we would have expected, although the weekly claims numbers are pretty strong. It's a really kind of a mixed bag when you look at the economy right now, Ariel. There are pockets of strength and there are pockets of weakness. When you net it out, we are growing more slowly than the past several years, but we don't know about inflation. And as Ed was saying, the Fed's dual mandate suggests that they maintain stable prices. And we don't know yet, and we won't for the next several months, what the full effect of the tariffs will be on the inflation rate. Will companies just eat the price increases, not pass them along to consumers, or will they raise prices and consumers will pay more at a time when they're still very, very sensitive about inflation rates?
And of course, the president has been obsessively talking about the fact that he believes that inflation rates are low. Garrett, the president says this Friday's deadline for his reciprocal tariffs on dozens of countries will not be extended. He's also saying that India, the leading producer, of course, of the phones that we use, those iPhones here in the U.S., will have a 25% tariff starting Friday. Do you expect Trump will follow through with this?
Ariel, I think experience has taught us that all of these deadlines are, let's say, malleable. The president is always open to negotiation, and he made clear just a few moments ago that on India, he's still negotiating after that post this morning setting a tariff rate, he says, for India, and basically what amounts to a punishment rate for their purchase of oil and natural gas products from Russia. The president intends to release letters to a number of these countries. They will call them deals, but they're essentially unilateral missives that will set the tariff rates for these various other countries with whom he's not struck more proper deals so far. But he and his economic aides have all made clear that he's always open to hearing an offer from countries. And there are some major economies, I'm thinking of places like South Korea, for example, who've not struck a deal and will probably want something more than just a dictated letter. So all of that's a long way of saying that I expect these negotiations to continue well beyond August 1st.
Contours of deals. Ed, you tweeted that Trump's 25% India tariff is, quote, obnoxious and yet another gift to China. You also say, quote, he's punishing poorer countries more than richer ones and alienating the global South. Stupidity doesn't cover the damage Trump is doing. Hey, how do you really feel?
Yeah, sorry, maybe social media encourages you to be blunter than you are on live TV. So I'll give you the modulated
You're such a gentleman
version.
on TV.
On TV, I'm more of a gentleman. Look, I mean, if the goal is to push America's friends and natural allies, such as India, the most important sort of piece of the global South, closer to China or alienate it more from the United States, then purely on geopolitical grounds, this makes no sense. India, as we've discussed, is now the major center for production of iPhones. People have moved their iPhone production to China. Apple and its contractors have moved it from China to India to diversify their supply chain and respond to successive American administrations' priorities here. Trump, if he's not bluffing, and you never can tell, but if that 25% tariff on India is a real threat and he carries it out, it's going to become uneconomic to produce iPhones in India. So that would be a serious blow to the biggest counterbalance we have to China in the world, anywhere, not just in the region. So hence my sort of use of that slightly impolitic word, stupid. I'd say it's strategic is the word I would use on television.
So it seems like we are squarely in the Trump era of global economics. Where do you see this going from here?
It's as Ed was just saying, and I read it all the time, and he's usually spot on. It's very difficult to assess at this juncture whether or not the tariffs will stick. But it does look like, Ariel, that our baseline tariffs are at about 15%, which is the highest level we've seen since the 1930s. And so President Trump is not backing away from this. He has backed away from his most, dramatic tariff threats, 50% or so on and so forth with China and other countries. But it does look like they're going to stick, and it does look like Chairman Powell will address that when he answers questions from reporters shortly.
What are you expecting that Fed Chair Powell could have to answer in those questions?
Well, my colleague Steve Leisman will be there from CNBC. They'll be throwing questions at him about whether or not there's an inclination to lower rates in September. Judging from the statement, it doesn't look like that's something he's inclined to commit to. He's saying the Fed is data dependent. So until or unless we know more about inflation coming down, I don't think he'll commit to lowering rates. There may be others who want to say that they will. He won't be the one to do it.
And back to you, Garrett. We're hearing about new tariffs possibly imposed on Brazil. Tell us about it.
Well, there's new penalties imposed in this case on a Brazilian Supreme Court justice being sanctioned. It's part of this 50% tariff that the president has threatened, or I suppose I should say it's related to it, because it all has to do with that country's handling of its case against their former president, Bolsonaro, who is a political ally of President Trump, who was accused of trying to essentially stage a coup after he was electorally defeated in Brazil in announcing these sky-high tariffs on Brazil. The president made it clear it was less about Brazil's economic policy, more about their treatment of Bolsonaro. Now you see these sanctions against a specific Supreme Court judge who's been working on that Bolsonaro case, showing that the president and this White House is going to use all of their available tools, or at least more of them than we are used to seeing, to try to influence what is a domestic political and legal fight within that country. Brazil's current president, the way, gave an interview to the New York Times recently and said they're not backing down on this. That case is in the judicial system. It's independent, and they're preparing to fight the U.S. as best they can on this issue.
And Garrett, no wiggle room on that Friday deadline, it seems.
Allegedly. All of these deadlines we've seen from the president have had at least some wiggle room. I'd be shocked if this is the one in which he's suddenly no longer interested in negotiating.
We will all keep watching it. Garrett Haake, Ed Luce, and Ron Insana, thank you all for being with us.